They didn't send a warning. No signal. No greeting. No polite knock on the door of a galaxy that had existed for 40,000 years without them. The first human fleet just showed up, and the chaos that followed wasn't the kind you see in movies. Not explosions right away. Not immediate fire. It was a quieter kind. The kind that spreads through a room when someone walks in, and nobody can quite figure out what they're going to do next. That's what scared the oldest civilizations in the known universe. Not the ships. Not the weapons. The fact that nobody, not one intelligence network, not one border patrol, not one ancient species with millennia of pattern recognition, could predict what these people were going to do next. Before you can understand what happened, you have to understand what the galaxy was before humanity arrived. Picture the oldest city you can imagine, not the grandest. The oldest, one that's been built and burned and rebuilt so many times that every single street has a story, and everyone living there has already heard all of them. The arguments have been had. The borders have been drawn. The painful lessons have been learned at enormous cost, and nobody, absolutely nobody, is in a hurry to learn them again. That was the galactic congregation, 40,000 years old, spanning hundreds of star systems, home to dozens of species who had, at various points in their histories, tried to destroy each other and eventually, exhaustedly, agreed not to. The Vreth had been mapping star systems, while humans were still figuring out agriculture. The Kale Dominion had fought and won 3 interstellar wars before humanity built its first pyramid. The Selhari, the oldest of all, so ancient that nobody was entirely sure how old, had gotten so tired of conflict that they'd stopped participating in it altogether, choosing instead to watch the cosmos from a comfortable distance like scholars who'd already read every book in the library and were now just reviewing their notes. It was a settled galaxy, layered, complicated. Every species had a place in it. Every border had been negotiated through processes that took centuries and involved thousands of diplomats and still managed to leave someone unhappy. The system wasn't perfect. Nothing that old ever is. But it worked the way old broken things sometimes do, through sheer accumulated habit, and because everyone involved had learned the hard way what the alternative looked like. There was a protocol when a new species arrived. Always had been. You sent a signal first. An introduction. Something that said, "We're here. We come in peace. We'd like to talk." This gave the congregation time to evaluate you, time to figure out who you were, what you wanted, where you fit in the hierarchy of things, time to decide how much of the galactic order needed adjusting to accommodate you, and how to manage that adjustment without everything falling apart. Every species in recorded history had done this, every single one. And then one day, on the long-range sensors of a Kale border station sitting at the edge of claimed space, 47 ships appeared out of faster-than-light travel, and were already moving before anyone finished processing that they were there. No signal. No greeting. No, hello, we come in peace. Just, here we are. We're moving. Figure it out. Supreme Commander Vetherano had commanded the border garrison at Kor Mahan for 11 years. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a man who startled easily. Kale don't startle easily as a rule. They're built for it, physically and psychologically, with that distributed nervous system that lets them process a crisis on multiple levels simultaneously. Add 40 years of military experience to that, and you get someone who can look at a bad situation and stay very calm while he figures out how bad it actually is. He looked at the sensor feeds when the alarms went off. He stayed calm. He studied the ships for about 45 seconds. And then something happened that hadn't happened to him since he was approximately 7 years old. He wasn't sure what to do. The human ships were all wrong. He couldn't explain it better than that at first. They were just wrong, in a way that didn't fit any of his categories. They weren't the sleek ceremonial craft that new species sometimes sent as an opening statement. They weren't military vessels in any configuration he recognized. They were somewhere in between, or maybe somewhere else entirely, a design philosophy he had no reference for. And they looked used, not damaged in combat, though there was some of that too. Used the way a tool gets used when someone has been working with it for a very long time and doesn't have a replacement handy. Repair patches on hull plating. One ship at the rear of the formation trailing a heat signature that meant someone hadn't quite finished fixing whatever they'd been fixing. Signs of wear on every vessel. The kind that comes not from neglect, but from effort, from being pushed and pushed and pushed again by people who didn't have the option of stopping. Veth opened a comm channel. Unidentified vessels. You have entered Kale Dominion space without authorization. Identify yourselves and state your purpose, or you will be escorted from this region by force. There was a pause. Then a voice came through the translation matrix. Human, female, tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. And underneath the tiredness, underneath it, not hidden by it, something harder, something Veth recognized from soldiers who had already done their accounting, already figured out what they were willing to pay. This is Admiral Sarah Voss of the Terran Exploration and Defense Fleet. We're not here to take anything that belongs to you. We need to speak with whoever is actually in charge, and we are not turning around. Veth stared at his screens. 47 ships, outnumbered at his garrison alone by better than 20-1. Hull damage visible on several of them. One of them was trailing a heat leak, and she was not turning around. He filed the emergency alert to Congregation High Command before he was fully aware of what he was feeling. He would spend a long time afterward trying to name it. The history of how humanity got to faster-than-light travel is not the kind of story anyone puts on inspirational posters. There's no triumphant moment, no gleaming laboratory and cheering scientists and humanity united in shared glory. The real version is messier and darker and, in its own way, more honest than any of that. It started with a war. Humanity's wars usually did start with something real, a genuine problem, a real shortage, an actual grievance, before becoming something monstrous. This one began over resources, fresh water, arable land, the kind of things you fight over when too many people need too much of things there aren't enough of. 3 major powers. 7 years. Weapons that didn't distinguish between targets as well as their users claimed they did. When it ended, the world was quieter than it had been in a long time. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something very loud. And in that quiet, something happened. It didn't have a name or a single moment of origin. It was more like a slow shift in weight, the kind of thing you don't notice until you realize you're standing somewhere different. People looked at what was left of the world they'd nearly burned down and asked, with a sincerity that previous generations hadn't quite managed, a question that felt almost too simple. What if we have to go somewhere else? Not as defeat, not as giving up, just as math, just as a cold, honest recognition that a species with their particular history of self-destruction maybe shouldn't keep all its eggs in one increasingly fragile basket. The fleet was built quietly, partly because they'd learned by then that announcing big projects early just gave people something to fight about, partly because some of the people building it weren't sure in the beginning whether it was hope or desperation. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe by a certain point those two things are just the same word. 31 years, piece by piece, component by component. 40,000 volunteers who understood what they were signing up for and went anyway. When it was ready, there was no celebration. They launched, because Earth had new problems by then. It always did. And the 40,000 people on those ships knew they were carrying something heavier than any cargo manifest recorded. They were carrying the part of humanity's future that might still be rescuable. The congregation's initial response was exactly what you'd expect from a 40,000-year-old bureaucracy confronted with something unprecedented. They formed a committee. It would take 2 years, they said. Standard timeline for assessing a new species. Figuring out what tier they occupied in the political hierarchy. Determining what rights they had and didn't have, and how the whole complicated machinery of galactic civilization needed to adjust to include them. 2 years. Voss sent a message directly to the Congregation Council, through channels she technically had no business accessing, which raised its own set of uncomfortable questions, and laid the situation out in plain language. Earth was dying, not in the dramatic way the phrase usually implies, with volcanoes or asteroids or any single catastrophic event that could be pointed to. In the slow way, the accumulated weight of centuries of industrial civilization pressing down on a biosphere that had never been designed to hold that much. The wars had accelerated what was already happening. The recovery efforts Real ones, genuine ones, funded and planned and argued over by serious people who cared, had been too slow against too much. The scientists had run the numbers many times, hoping to find an error. They kept getting the same answer. 60 years. Give or take. 60 years before the ecological unraveling reached a point where the planet couldn't sustain its population anymore. Not the end of all life on Earth. It wasn't that dramatic. The end of Earth as a viable home for 8 billion people. The end of the version of the future where everything eventually worked out without anyone having to leave. 60 years. The congregation had spent 600 years on the last major border negotiation. Voss wasn't asking for rescue. She wasn't asking for the galaxy to solve humanity's problems. She was asking for one thing: the right to explore, the right to move through congregation space looking for uninhabited systems, candidate worlds, somewhere, anywhere, that might eventually, with enough work, become somewhere people could live. She was asking for the right to look for a way out. The council received the message. They debated for 4 months. During those 4 months, the human fleet did not sit still. They'd been ordered to hold position at the edge of Kale space. So they held position at the edge of Kale space, technically, in the sense that they didn't cross any lines they'd been explicitly told not to cross. But they moved, slowly, methodically, within sensor range of every border station watching them. Always visible, never hiding. They explored the edges of charted space, ran surveys on stellar bodies, mapped gravitational patterns, cataloged things no one had asked them to catalog because the data might be useful someday, and you don't waste an opportunity to collect useful data. The congregation observer assigned to monitor them was a Vreth diplomat named Thesakai, 70 years old, professional to her bones, not given to hyperbole. After 17 days, she sent back a report that was, for a diplomatic document, unusually direct. "They don't know how to stop," she wrote. "I want to be careful not to editorialize, so let me be clear that I mean this descriptively, not critically. 17 days of surveillance. 0 extended periods of inactivity across any of the 47 vessels. They repair equipment. They run simulations. They study their survey data, and then run the analysis again from a different angle. They train. They argue, often loudly, and sometimes about things that seem to an outside observer to be genuinely trivial, and then the argument ends and they go back to working. The stillness that other species default to in a waiting period is simply not in their behavioral repertoire. I cannot determine yet whether this is cultural, psychological, or something more fundamental. I suspect the distinction may not matter. For beings who learned, over a very long history, that stopping meant dying, the two may have become the same thing. The report was filed. Read. Quietly passed around to people who weren't sure what to do with it. Then the council issued its ruling. Denied. Humanity's request for exploration rights was rejected. The political risks were too significant. The precedent too dangerous. An unvetted species, designated Tier 0, emerging with all the restrictions that status implied, could not simply be granted freedom of movement through a political structure that had taken 40,000 years to stabilize. If humanity wanted full rights, the proper process existed. 300 years, approximately. There was a long silence in the chamber when the ruling was read aloud. And then Thesakai, who had spent 4 decades watching civilizations navigate moments like this, who had always been professionally careful to keep her observations clinical, said 4 words that nobody had expected from her. "This is a mistake." The chamber erupted. On the flagship of the Terran fleet, Admiral Sarah Voss read the ruling once. Then she got up, walked to the observation port, and stood there for a while looking at the stars. Her crew watched her. No one said anything. There's a certain kind of silence that forms around a commanding officer when people understand that something important is happening inside a decision they're not being asked to weigh in on. She turned around. Her face was calm. Not the performed calm of someone trying not to show what they're feeling. The real kind. The kind on the other side of a reckoning. Plot a course. Deep into congregation space. No weapons hot. No combat formations. Nothing that looks like aggression. But we're going. Her first officer stared at her. "Admiral, that's..." "It's math," Voss said. Quietly. 60 years. They want 300. Addis, do the math. Nobody spoke. We're not threatening anyone, she continued. We're not taking anything. We're looking for somewhere to live. If they won't let us look, she stopped. Let that sit for a moment. Then we look anyway. The course was plotted. The fleet moved. The congregation had never dealt with anything quite like what followed. They sent interceptor wings, Kale ships, fast and heavily armed, positioned directly across the human fleet's path. The kind of show of force that had worked reliably for 12,000 years of Kale military history. The kind of position that said, clearly and without ambiguity, you stop here or we stop you. The human fleet went around, not frantically, not desperately, with a kind of calm efficiency that suggested they'd already mapped the alternatives before the interceptors arrived, and they just chose the fastest route. When the Kale pivoted to give chase, they found, and this detail circulated through congregation military channels for weeks afterward, that the human ships were faster in exactly the ways that mattered, not dramatically faster, not in every metric, but in the specific vectors that made an effective pursuit difficult. They were faster, as if they'd anticipated the response, as if they'd gamed out the scenario before it happened and optimized for it. 3 separate Vreth diplomatic teams attempted contact over the following 6 weeks. Voss talked to all of them, in person, on screen, directly. She was open and willing and warm in a way none of the diplomats had expected. She answered every question honestly. She expressed real respect for what the congregation represented. And then, after each conversation, she kept moving. Every diplomat filed the same note in slightly different words. Something along the lines of, she means every word she says. She also intends to keep going. The Selhari, who hadn't engaged with galactic politics in 2,000 years, sent a message to the council. It said, watch them carefully. The congregation assembled a real response. 112 warships, 6 species, a blockade across the most probable vector of the human fleet's advance, positioned 6 days ahead of their current trajectory. The humans saw it coming almost immediately, and they didn't stop. They slowed. They didn't arm. But they started broadcasting, not to the blockade fleet, not to the council, but to every inhabited system within range. In 17 congregation languages, the same message, cycling continuously. We are humanity. 40,000 people on 47 ships. We left our home because it is dying. We asked for permission to look for somewhere to go. We were told to wait 300 years. We cannot wait 300 years. We are not here to threaten anyone. We are not here to take what belongs to you. We are asking you to see us. That was the whole thing. No demands. No ultimatum. No list of conditions. Just see us. The congregation's leadership would later describe what happened next as an unusual period of public sentiment, which is a very diplomatic way of saying that ordinary people across a dozen species watched a broadcast from 40,000 exhausted humans in damaged ships asking to be seen and felt something. Not all of them. There were plenty who saw it as manipulation, a calculated appeal to emotion from a species trying to use sentiment to circumvent legitimate governance. That's not an unreasonable position, but enough people felt it, enough to matter. And when the blockade fleet positioned itself across the human fleet's path, 112 ships against 47, something happened that no tactical projection had included. Voss stopped, not a feint. She didn't try to go around this time. She brought her fleet to a complete halt and held position, and then she opened a channel to the Kale fleet commander on the other side, Admiral Sovameth. 40 years of service, not a sentimental being by any observable measure. I know what this looks like, Voss said, and I know you can destroy us. I'm not asking you not to. I'm asking you to look at something first. She sent a file. Images of Earth, the beautiful ones. Mountain ranges catching light at strange hours. Cities alive at night. Oceans that went on further than you could see. And then the other ones. Coastlines pulled back to show gray mud where water used to be. Forests reduced to ash that stretched in every direction until it met the horizon. Flood lines on city buildings. And then images of children. Human children doing the things children do. Playing in water. Laughing at something off camera. One small child sitting at a window looking up at the sky with an expression that has no species, no cultural context, no explanation beyond what it is. A young thing looking up and wondering. Admiral Sova Meth of the Kale Dominion, 40 years of command, put her hand over her face. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Stand your fleet down. Not to the humans, to her own ships. Unauthorized order. She knew it was unauthorized. She issued it anyway. Nobody fires. Then to Voss, follow me. I'm taking you to the council personally, and I will be there when you speak. The session lasted 9 days. In the official historical record, it's described as unprecedented in its intensity, which you might expect from any document written by beings who spent 400 centuries developing a gift for understatement. Voss didn't give speeches. She gave data. 6 hours on the first day alone. Not rhetoric, not performance, just the undecorated facts of Earth's situation laid out with the steady, methodical precision of someone who has been carrying this information for a long time and finally has somewhere to put it. She answered everything. Every challenge. Every procedural objection. Every attempt to find an inconsistency in her numbers. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't plead. She was simply, relentlessly honest. Near the end, a senior Vreth council member asked her, not unkindly, why humanity deserved to be trusted in congregation space, given that they'd already violated it without permission. Voss was quiet for a moment. Because we're still here talking, she said. Not because you outgun us, though you do, because this is what we'd rather do. We've had enough war. Honestly, we'd had more than enough of it for more generations than I can count. It's why we're in this situation in the first place. She paused. We're here talking because talking is the only thing we know how to do that doesn't end with someone's children paying the bill. No one said anything. I won't tell you we're a peaceful species, she said. We're not. Our history should genuinely worry you. And I'll understand if it does. But we are here. 40,000 people in ships that are held together in some places with less than I'd like, at the edge of everything we've ever known, asking for the right to find somewhere our kids can grow up. She looked around the chamber. That's not aggression. That's something else. A long pause. I think you know what it is. The vote passed. Not unanimously. Nothing in the congregation ever passes unanimously, but it passed. Provisional exploration rights. 12 designated corridors through congregation space. Not membership. Not unlimited access. Enough. Enough to look. The human survey teams moved through their corridors with an efficiency that made congregation surveyors quietly uncomfortable. They didn't just search for habitable planets. They cataloged everything, shared all of it with their counterparts unprompted. When a Vreth science vessel's navigation system failed in a remote system 6 months in, the nearest ship to respond wasn't Vreth. It was human. 12-hour detour. Voss authorized it without hesitation. Small things. But small things add up. And in the 43rd week of the survey operation, a scout ship called the Meridian dropped into a system 200 light-years from home. The pilot was Lieutenant Commander Yael Kovacs, 28 years old, born on a ship, one of the first generation, who'd never stood on the planet her parents still called home. She'd grown up hearing about Earth the way some people talk about a place they visited once that they can't quite stop thinking about. Something real, something loved, but also something fading. She ran her scans, ran them again, sat still for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time when you're 28 and the universe has just handed you something you told yourself to stop expecting. She keyed her comm. Fleet Command, this is Meridian. Her voice was not steady exactly, but held. I need you to verify my readings. I think. A pause. A sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. I think I found us somewhere to go. The world had no name. It sat in the middle of its star's habitable zone like it had simply been there waiting, patient in a way that only things which have never needed to be anything else can be. It wasn't perfect. Gravity ran slightly high. The atmosphere would need years of work before anyone lived on the surface without a suit. Most of the landmass was covered in something the biologists would spend years arguing about, a vast network of low, branching plant analogs that spread across the ground in every shade from deep violet to pale gold, like a living tapestry thrown across 2 continents. But there was water, liquid water, abundant and planet-wide and real. The star was stable. The geology was quiet. And when Kovacs landed and stood on the surface for the first time, in full environmental suit, because you don't gamble with other people's futures, not when 40,000 lives depend on you getting the small calls right, she looked up at a sky that faded from deep amber at the horizon to something that darkened overhead into a shade that felt, in a way she couldn't quite explain, almost familiar. She cried. She didn't file the report right away. She gave herself 5 minutes. Just stood there. Let it be real for 5 minutes before it became a report, a data set, a discovery with coordinates and atmospheric readings, and all the bureaucratic weight of something important. 5 minutes for herself. Then she filed the report. The news reached Earth 6 hours later. Not through official channels. Those take time. Through personal messages. Carefully worded. Coded in the shorthand that people develop when they know their communications are being reviewed. But the meaning got through. 3 words. They found something. Person to person. City to city. Settlement to settlement. Across a planet that had been holding its breath for 31 years. They found something. The celebrations were quiet. That surprised some people who'd imagined this moment would be loud. But there's a specific quality to relief when it's large enough. It doesn't come out as noise. It comes out in the way an old woman in a climate displacement camp sits down suddenly, as if her legs have decided they don't need to hold her up so hard anymore. It comes out in parents looking at their children and feeling the knot in their chest loosen by something they can't measure. It comes out in a child watching the adults around her cry and understanding, without being told, that something very important just became okay. Voss got the news on her bridge. Read the first report. Set it down. Looked around at her crew, at the people who had crossed the border of the known world without permission, who had faced down a blockade and kept talking, who had been doing this in damaged ships for over a year with no guarantee it would end any particular way. For a moment, she just looked at them, and looked, honestly, like exactly what she was. A human being. Tired. Relieved. A little undone. Well, she said. Her voice was rough in a good way. The way a voice gets when it's carrying more than it's showing. Let's go see what we've got. The new world's name was never officially decided. The naming committee was formed, met 8 times, produced 47 proposals, and couldn't reach consensus on any of them. This is also very human. This is what humans do with things that matter. So people just kept calling it what they've been calling it in their private messages since Kovacs first stood on the surface. Forward. The first permanent structure built on Forward was a medical center. Nobody voted on that decision. Nobody needed to. Humans are practical like that. You take care of people first and name things second. Voss walked through the door on the day it was completed, looked around at the clean walls and the equipment being carefully uncrated by people who had hauled it across 40 light years in the belly of a ship that was held together in places by sheer institutional stubbornness. She looked around, said nothing for a moment. Then, this'll do. And it would. The congregation spent centuries trying to understand humanity. Symposiums, papers, academic conferences where highly distinguished beings said very intelligent things and came away with more questions than they'd arrived with. Some species stayed wary. Others became genuine allies. The Selhari, ancient contemplative, 2,000 years deep into voluntary detachment from galactic affairs, quietly admitted to each other that the arrival of humanity had shaken them loose from something they hadn't realized had hardened. But the question that kept appearing in more papers and more debates and more late-night conversations between beings who'd had enough to drink to be honest was always the same one. What are humans? The Sakai, who had watched them since the beginning, who'd filed more reports on humanity than anyone in congregation history, who had been offered 3 different reassignments and declined all of them, answered that question exactly once. In a private message to an old friend, she wrote, "They are what happens when a species spends 10,000 years learning that nothing is guaranteed, and the only answer to that is to keep going anyway. They are what happens when grief and love and stubbornness all point in the same direction at the same time. They are the thing you didn't know you'd forgotten was possible until you see it, and then you can't quite look away." She sent the message. Then she turned back to her window, looked out at the stars. And somewhere in those stars, on a planet with an amber sky, a city called Forward was putting up its second hospital, its third school, its first park. Just a few acres of native violet ground cover, preserved exactly as Kovacs had found it, low fence around it, a small sign at the entrance. The sign read, "This is where we started. Remember where we came from. Remember what it cost. Remember why we're here." Someone, probably a child based on the handwriting, had added something underneath in different ink. And don't stop, they never did. You could outgun them. History shows this clearly. You could block every path, outnumber them 10-1, tell them in 17 languages that the door was closed. You could be patient and ancient and write about the rules in every technical sense that mattered. And it still wouldn't be enough. Not because humans are invincible. They're not. Not because they don't feel fear. They do. They feel the way they feel everything, which is too much and all at once, and without the benefit of a nervous system designed to pace it out. But because somewhere in a long, terrible education of their history, they'd learned something that the oldest species in the galaxy, comfortable in their protocols and their caution, had quietly let go of. They'd learned that the future isn't something that happens to you. It's something you go get, even when the door is closed, even when the math is against you, even when you're in a damaged ship trailing a heat signature that you haven't quite fixed yet. Even then, especially then, that's what made them different. That's what made them dangerous. That's what made the oldest minds in the galaxy sit quietly at their windows and watch the stars and feel something they hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. Something that feels, if you let yourself admit it, a little like hope